Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. King's Landing 3:05 AC. Davos. He woke up with a headache, though he knew it was nothing like the headache he was about to face for the rest of the day. The king and queen were off fighting in another battle, and he was left here to run the realm, the mere thoughts of which were the cause of the headache he was now suffering through. Readying himself for the day, he left the Tower of the Hand and made his way to the royal apartments to break his fast. This was at least the part of the day he didn't mind so much, and as he walked with his guards through the corridors, he laughed when the White Wolf came running his way. I miss them too, Ghost," he said as he looked down on the forlorn-looking wolf who licked his hand. He knew upon seeing the wolf that Missandei wasn't too far behind, and true enough, just as they turned the next corner, he saw her, Davos unable to resist, returning the warm smile that she gave him, and then joining her as they walked into a small dining room. Both Arya and Gendry were already there and had begun to eat, and he bid them both good morning as he took his seat. Davos, finding that the appetite he'd worried about not having now quickly returned to him as he sat with people he enjoyed spending time with. There would not be many of those today, he feared. As he ate, he listened as Arya complained to Gendry that her brother should have taken her with him, and as Gendry did his best to listen to those complaints and not offer any comment either way, the girl wasn't looking for a reason why Axion had left her here, and Davos knew that he'd told her his reasons in the long talk they had before he'd said his goodbyes. More it was that she wished to vent her frustrations, and Gendry was more than willing to allow her to do so. Looking to Missandei, he could see that she was worried too. The king, the queen, and Grey Worm were all gone on the ships, and she'd been left here once again, just like him. "You understand why they asked us to stay," he said softly to the girl. Missandei, giving him a small smile and nodding. "We will go to the small council meeting after this," she asked, and he nodded. "I will find out what our other counselors are like, and who they hold their true allegiance to." Davos said, and he saw how Missandei and then Arya looked at him, the latter being the one who spoke. "You think they'll not be true to Dany, my brother?" the girl asked angrily. "I know not, Arya. They may seek to take advantage of the king and queen not being here, or they may understand the chance they've been given and seek to bring about the changes the realm needs. We'll find out soon enough," Davos said. "And if they're not true?" Gendry asked, and Davos chuckled when he saw Missandei reach down to rub the White Wolf's head. "Then they'll find out what happens when you play with dragons," Missandei said with no emotion in her voice. Once they were finished eating, he then said his goodbyes to Arya and Gendry, who were heading into the city itself. He told them to make sure to take their guards with them, and while Arya frowned at him, she listened. When Missandei said it was more as a symbol than as protection, Davos marveling just how easily she could get her to believe that lie. "Shall we, Davos?" Missandei said when she was ready, and then he joined her and Ghost as they walked to the small council chambers. He took his seat when they arrived, with Missandei sitting on his left, and then a few moments later, Lord Varys entered with Lady Waynwood taking a little longer to turn up, and surprisingly walking into the chambers with Lord Connington by her side. After they had all taken their seats, Davos felt like reaching to the mug in front of him and draining the water that was inside it. He felt his throat go dry, and he knew if he wasn't sitting with his hands clasped together on his lap, that they'd be shaking. Turning to glance at Missandei, it was the reassuring smile he saw on her face that steadied his nerves. "As you are all aware, their graces have traveled to see that Dorne is liberated, and Princess Arianne is once again installed as its princess. Lord Varys, could you tell the other counselors what their graces may face?" he said, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw the slight nod that Missandei gave him, and he thanked the gods that Axion and Dany had left her with him. As Lady Kinvara explained to their graces, a force of Usse origin, and led by Prince Quentyn, has taken Sunspear and is in control of Dorne, however. My little birds have sung me whispers that not all of Dorne is happy with this turn of events. Food, men, and loyalty have all been denied, thus far, and unless Prince Quentyn can see his sisters and our king and queen's forces defeated, then his time as Prince of Dorne will be a short one. Very sad. How large is the force that Prince Quentyn can call upon? Lady Anya asked. Significant, my lady, and was it just Princess Arianne against her brother then? Perhaps it would be enough to keep Dorne with their Grace's own forces and with the dragons. Well, Varys said, leaving the rest unsaid. The usse forces, do we know who is behind them? Lord Connington asked. The same people behind the attack on Mirren and the attack on Volantis, the Triarchs, Lord Connington. Varys said, and Davos saw Jon Connington nod. Greedy fuckers. They tried to hire the company some time ago, but we were already under contract, and so were unable to even consider their offer. They never came back to us, though. Lord Connington said, and Davos looked to Varys, but it was Lady Anya who spoke. I take it their graces won't let the fall of Meereen stand. Lady Anya said, and Davos looked to Miss Andy, as he was not sure how much he should tell the woman. Queen Daenerys freed the people of Meereen, and will do so again. King Aegon will wish to see this also. Miss Andy said, and Lady Anya nodded. May I speak freely? Lady Anya asked. You may, my lady, Davos said, looking curiously at the woman. Their grace's attention is rightly focused on Dorne and I assume on Meereen, which then leaves us to see to the realm itself. I never expected to be in such a lofty position, something I'm sure you yourself, Lord Hand, can relate to. Lady Anya said, and he nodded with a smirk. Now that I find I am most keen to keep it. The realm is in a bad way, my lords. It is up to us as their graces' representatives to see that it recovers from all it's been through. Davos looked at the surprised look on Varys' face, and was sure it was a good surprise rather than a bad one. That the eunuch was showing, Jon Connington too seemed to be exhibiting the same look on his face, and while Missandei's own expression was far more schooled, she also seemed pleased by what Lady Anya had said. Then it is up to us here in this room to see that their will is done and that the people's lives are improved. Is it not? Davos said. That it is, Lord Connington said. And this time, Miss Anday did smile at him. For the next hour, they spoke of coin, of their food stocks, and of what each part of the realm was most in need of, and some things became very clear to him. Lord Jon Connington was as loyal to the dragons as he, Varys or Missandei, was, and Lady Anya was a formidable woman who his king and queen had done well in naming to their council. By the end of the meeting, he was feeling far better than he had when he woke up that morning, and surprisingly his headache was gone. He waited until Lady Anya and Lord Jon had left, and then turned to look at Miss Yandier, who sat with a small smile on her face, and at Varys who, though wearing his usual unreadable expression, looked content. At a nod from him, all three of them got up to leave the room. There was much work to be done, but at least they had the right people in place to see to it. Now all any of them wished was for their king and queen to return safely. King's Landing 3005 AC. Arya. She and Jon had argued when he told her that he needed her to stay in the city, that there were people there who he needed an eye kept on, and while Davos, Varys, and Missandei could all do so, she could do so better than any of them. The main person to be watched, it seemed, was someone that she'd not actually need to sneak much in the shadows to see, as his own eyes had found hers ever since Gendry had asked Jon's permission to marry her. Gendry's brother did not think of him in the same way as she did Jon, though, and Arya couldn't but help remember something that Sansa would say when Jon's name was brought up when they were children. He's our half-brother, Arya. As a child, it would annoy her. Make her angry, and in her childish mind wouldn't make any sense. Arya had not been sure how anyone could be a half of something. At times when she caught Edric Storm look her way, she'd have to stop herself from smiling. Not at him, but at what had always been her favorite answer when Sansa had said such things. Really, Sansa? He looks a full brother to me. She knew that Gendry didn't feel that way, and it was very clear that Edric Storm did, given how his nose scrunched up as if he was smelling something bad every time he saw Gendry. It had made her want to take needle and cut that nose from his face, to stick him with the pointy end and take his eyes from him for daring to look at Gendry that way. Yet she had not, that was not her, not anymore, and for his sake, Edric Storm had better hope that she remained someone. You're doing it again, Gendry said, and she stopped walking and turned to glare at him. Doing what? Making your eye face. Gendry said annoyingly. My what? She said snippily. You're a Raja face. You do it when someone has annoyed you or when you're thinking of someone who's annoying you. Gendry said with a half smile on his face. You mean like some annoying bull? She said with a roll of her eyes. Ah, that's how I recognize it, he said, and despite her annoyance, she chuckled. This city still smells like shit, she said, changing the subject, as they began to walk again. It smells like home, he said fondly, and she looked at him before shaking her head. This wasn't home, nor was Winterfell. Home wasn't a place for her. It was a person. No, now it was more than one person. Home was Jon, Dany, Gendry, and even Missandei. It was Davos and Lacarex, Rhaegal and Drogon. Home was ghost and the feel of white fur under her fingertips. Home was family. It was the family she had, and the family she would have one day. Arya, not even noticing when her hand touched her belly, and felt what she hoped was the life growing inside of her. They turned into the Street of Steel. Gendry wished to speak to Tobo Mott and thank him for the training, roof, and comfort he'd given him over the years. Though his life had not been altogether pleasant working for the Corrick Smith, he had looked after him as much as any man other than Davos, and Gendry felt he owed him his thanks. When they reached the Smiths, she waited outside as Gendry walked in to talk to the man, and that's when she saw him again. Her first thought was that he had followed them, and instinctively her fingers brushed over Needle's hilt as she reassured herself. It was there on her hip. When she saw his face more clearly, though, she realized that he'd not been following or looking for either of them, and so she relaxed somewhat. It surprised her when Edric Storm walked over to her, and she was glad that Gendry chose that precise time to walk from the Smiths. "Princess Arya," Edric said with a small bow, and given how he had looked at Gendry, she felt no desire to correct him. "Lord Baratheon," she said, as she then looked to the men who were with him. There were 3 guards and a knight, and she felt she could take them all if need be. Not that there would be a need, but it was something that her mind did in most situations, dangerous or not. "And you must be Gendry. Or is it Lord Gendry?" Edric asked, and though there was mocking in the tone, it was less than she expected. "Just Gendry, Lord Baratheon," Gendry said, and Arya was pleased by how firm his voice was. He'd come a long way since speaking to Jon, and was now far more confident in who he was, much to her delight. "I was wondering if you'd both care to join me for lunch. There are things I'd like to discuss with you." "Gendry, things regarding our father." Though she didn't wish to, her eyes glanced at Gendry to judge his reaction. He may not think of Edric how she did Jon, but she knew he thought of him as kin, and so he may wish to get to know him better. It turned out she was right, and after she'd given him a slight nod to let him know she was willing to do whatever it was he wished, he turned and accepted the offer, and they all began to walk down the street together. The conversation was stilted, uncomfortable, and she was glad when they reached and entered the tavern, Arya quickly taking a seat with the wall at her back so that she could see the entire room. That had forced Edric to sit opposite her, and Gendry was just an added bonus. The brief flare of annoyance on the man's face, one that she welcomed. It showed how he truly felt, and that he was deferring to her, and not to Gendry. Her love was beneath him. While she was not, that was very clear in how he looked at each of them, if not in the words he spoke. "Do you know much of our father other than what you've heard?" Edric asked. "No, I've heard the stories, and when I first met His Grace, we spoke of who I assumed his own father was and how he and ours had fought together." Gendry said, "An uncomfortable conversation in light of what we've all since found, no doubt," Edric said with a half laugh. His Grace understood things differently at the time, so no, it wasn't uncomfortable. Gendry said firmly, and Arya had to keep herself from chuckling. Her bull had a backbone. "Did you know we have a sister in the Vale, Maya Stone?" Edric asked, changing the subject, and she saw Gendry move forward in his seat. "No, I had thought, after he died, the Queen sent men to kill me. I had no idea it was her, or why. At the time, but later, Lord Davos told me what she'd done, the same to our brothers and sisters." Gendry said sadly, "I heard I was safe in Storm's End, or so I thought." Edric said, his voice trailing off as he thought of something. "Your sister in the Vale. She is safe?" Arya asked a few moments, as both brothers had seemed lost in their own thoughts for some time. "She is, as far as I can tell. She runs mules to and from the Aerie, delivers the food stocks, and supplies up the treacherous mountain pass," Edric said contemptuously, and though she noticed, Gendry did not. Her bull instead was sitting there with a warm smile on her face. "Is she the only one other than yourselves?" she asked, and both Gendry and Edric looked at her very differently. Gendry had a hopeful look on his face, one which almost seemed to wish that there were more, and that some had survived what the Queen had done. Edric, however, almost looked frightened, and she caught how he looked at the knight that was with him, and then back at Gendry. But he didn't see how she looked at him, and how intently she was watching him was something she put down to arrogance. Lords had a way of ignoring those they thought beneath them, be it socially, physically, or because they thought themselves smarter, and with women, this was especially true. "No, as far as I'm aware, it's only us 3, Edric said, and Gendry looked at him with a sad expression on his face. "A Waters Stone and a Baratheon. It seems it's up to you to keep the name alive," Gendry said, and she caught the look of surprise on Edric's face. I had thought you'd seek to be legitimized, given how friendly you and His Grace are, Edric said. A statement, though really a question. I'm happy with who I am, Gendry said, and she smiled when she heard him say so. Things changed a little after that. Edric seemed to relax more, and she listened as he told of life at Storm's End and as Gendry spoke of his own life in King's Landing. For the briefest of moments, she actually thought that some corner had been turned and the two brothers may actually seek to be closer. She knew if it was up to Gendry, then he would certainly seek that, and that he may even seek out his sister in the Vale. With Edric, she had briefly hoped, right up to when the meal ended, and they had said their goodbyes. I'm glad we've done this, Edric said as they stood outside the tavern. Aye, me too. It was good to speak to you. I hope to see you again, but I have to leave for Storm's End in a day or two. Perhaps in time you could come and visit me there, Edric said. I'd like that, Gendry replied, a true smile on his face. Princess, Lord Baratheon. She watched as they walked away, Edric speaking frantically to the knight, and she knew then that it had all been an act, a mummery. He meant her bullharm, and despite Gendry's thoughts, which no doubt were of a found brother, he'd only truly found an enemy this day. Targaryen felt her heart harden, her resolve strengthen, and she knew she had to become no one once more. Edric Storm needed to play the game of faces, and she needed to know his intent for certain before she put Gendry's brother in the ground. Scene 305 AC. Bellico Station A. He stood on the balcony of the Great Pyramid and smiled at the city below him, his city and the first step in the new Essos that he would forge. The greatest empire the world had ever seen. He would build it and rule the lands from the narrow sea to the great sand one. Most of his work was already done for him, and she didn't even realize it. The Unsullied and the Dothraki were no longer here, and Essos was now his for the taking. Malachord would fail. Quentyn would fail. And yet he cared not. They would distract, delay, and should they be lucky enough to take a dragon or two, then all the better. By the time the Dragon Queen came back his way, he'd have 3 or 4 times the number of men she had. He'd control all the major cities and major ports, and even with her landing on his shores, she'd see losses, and then he'd bleed them all the way until their end. Taking a last look at the city, he turned and made his way back inside to deal with the foolish men who sought his favor. The great, the good, and the wise masters would all learn their true place today, and would be given a simple choice: either they kneel or die. Looking to his giant guard, he nodded and then walked into the room, making his way up the steps to sit on what had once been Daenerys Targaryen's throne. With a nod and a wave of his hands, the masters were brought in, and Bellico took his seat. Welcome, my friends, to the new Meereen, the new Essos, he said, as they looked at him confusedly. Together we have taken back this city from the Dragon Queen, yet that is not our only victory this day, Bellico said. The dragon whore is dead, one of the masters of Yunkai asked, hopefully. She has fallen, one of the masters of Astapor asked. Why do you sit there? The Green Grace asked. Because it is my divine right to sit here, Galaza, and know, my friends, the dragon lives still. Today the great cities of Astapor and Yunkai have fallen too, the Leto said to confused looks. We were betrayed by who? The Yunkai masters said as one. We must sail immediately, he heard one of the Astapor masters say. And he found himself looking at neither them nor the great masters of Meereen, but the Green Grace, who now wore a smile as she dropped to her knees. The great, the good, and the wise masters all looked at the old woman as she knelt, and then Bellico laughed when the great masters did likewise. It took far more time than he would have liked for the good and wise masters to realize that it was him that had taken their cities, and the angry voices seemed like noise to him. Yet the threats were real and needed to be answered, and so Bellico raised his hand and held up 4 fingers and sat back in his throne to watch. His men were quick, and though the pain screams didn't last long, though he enjoyed them all the same, smiling as to each of the good and wise masters were repeatedly stabbed in front of him. Once it was done, he looked at the remaining masters, and it didn't take a word from him to bring them to their knees. Slaver's Bay was his, and yet it was only to be the start of things, and so once the masters had sworn to him, he moved to what had once been the Queen's quarters, though it had most recently been home to a sellsword, and he bid the Green Grace to join him. Kaxla Dazale was almost 100 years old, and yet she moved as if she was a far younger woman, be it her faith or other things. Something kept her spry, and he wished to know what that was, and if she was like him. When she entered the room and he looked into her eyes, he could see that she was not, and so he relaxed somewhat. The woman was a potential ally now rather than a threat. He bid her sit and sent for wine and refreshments, not partaking in either and smiling when she took some of both. "Ye know who I am?" he asked, and she nodded. "And why I'm here?" "We have but a peace," she said, and he smiled. "You will take me to it," he said, and she nodded, looking at him eagerly. She rose when he did, and they walked from the room. The palanquin was ready for him as soon as they left the pyramid. His men knew that he didn't forgive tardiness and were far too happy with their lives to incur his displeasure. It took some time to reach the Temple of the Harpy. Bellico, noticing how Galaza kept looking his way along the ride, whatever it was she was seeking to find in him was beyond him. He knew not what face he showed anymore, his eyes barely recognizing the face that he saw in the looking glass these days. "We are here," Gatsa said, and he nodded as he climbed down from the palanquin and she led him into the temple. It took them even longer to reach the depths of the temple itself. Bellico, feeling excited for once as he felt the power of the magic that was contained here. When Galaza cut her hand to open the door, he smiled, and as they were hit by the green light that bathed the room, they entered it. He saw the chest on the raised pillar and moved to it without being asked, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the room as he drew closer. When he was almost halfway there, he heard the crunch of the bones beneath him, and looking down to the floor, he saw the remains of those who had tried before him, those who had failed where he would not. Reaching the pillar, he opened the chest and looked down on the black stone inside. It was broken. Only a piece of the whole, but he could feel the power that was contained within. Not enough for what needed to be done, but more than he had gathered so far. It would take the full stone to truly bring the night, but he had fewer pieces left to find now, and he knew where they all were. He reached inside and felt the stone in his hands, and the power coursed through him as he lifted it. The black stone of the Bloodstone Emperor would soon be whole again, and he, Bellico Stagonen, the High Priest of the Church of Starry Wisdom, would fulfill his destiny. Seagard 305 AC. Siengir. Sansa wasn't happy with being made to leave Riverrun, and he felt for her. Truly, he did. Though he was beginning to think that in some ways she was causing herself some of the problems she faced. Her words about Jon and Daenerys didn't match up with what he knew about them both. The Queen had welcomed Yara, and when they had sailed to Meereen, she had listened to his sister's words and her request, and had then given her the Iron Islands when she had asked for them. Jon had forgiven him for what he had done to Robb, and at Winterfell, true, he'd sent him away when he had returned there. But Theon had understood the reasons for that, and in a way had welcomed it. He had no true desire to stay there once he'd seen Beth Castle, and he doubted he'd be alive today if he had. Jon, though, had forgiven him when they spoke at Dragonstone. So even though he'd sent him away, it was that he thought about now as they boarded the ship. To him, Jon and Daenerys were good people, while to Sansa, they had conspired against her and forced her from her home. It didn't add up, and yet, why would she lie? It had been her that he'd truly come back for. To repay her for allowing him to be himself once more, and to protect her and the Starks even if it meant losing his own life. Yet he'd arrived to a sane side he didn't really recognize, and the more time they spent together, the more that was starting to become true. Seeing her in the Vale in River Run, listening as she spoke of Jon and Daenerys and named her brother as a bastard, even though he was not, was somewhat disconcerting to him. As was how she had behaved with Lord Arryn while they stayed in the Vale, and with how she spoke of her uncle and good aunt on the road to Seagard. All he could do was hope that once they reached the Iron Islands and she was settled, that then the sane side he knew would return. "How long until we reach the Iron Islands?" Sansa asked, and Theon turned, surprised to see her standing there with him on deck. "Less than a week, if the winds are good." "Will your sister welcome me?" Sansa asked slightly worriedly. "Yadra is my sister, and she'll accept what I ask of her." Theon said more confidently than he usually was, though he knew Yadra would wish him happy. "She's close to the dragon whore," Sansa said, and as always, hearing her use those words shocked him. "She is, but I'm her brother," he said, and Sansa nodded before touching his shoulder, and then turning to walk below deck. He knew Yadra would accept them both. She'd give them good rooms and see they were looked after. It may not be the life that Sansa had expected, but it would be a good life if she wished it to be. Who knows, perhaps in time she, Jon, and Daenerys could put aside their differences, and if she wished it, then she could return to Winterfell. Though he hoped she'd instead stay with him on Pike. There were few people who knew him truly these days. Yadra and Sansa, he knew, did, and he needed to be around people he knew, lest he loses himself and becomes Reek once more. After he waited until they had left the bay, Theon turned and walked to his cabin. stopping by Sansa's to make sure she had everything she needed. Once he was certain she did, he made his way to his own cabin, and after entering it, he lay down on his bed. Try as he might, he knew he'd not keep his eyes open. And once they closed, the dreams would come. Once more, something that terrified him more than anything. When he slept, he was never free, never alone, and the ghosts would haunt him until the morning. Ramsay would come first, and then Sir Roderick, Luwin, the miller's boys, and all the faces that he knew from Winterfell, and who had died when he had taken the keep. All of those he could bear to see. But it was the one that came last that always caused him his true distress. The one that waited for him as always, and was there when his eyes closed and he drifted off to sleep. I trusted you. You were my brother by choice. You betrayed me. He woke up with a start, Robb's voice still echoing in his head, and he did what he always did each morning. He woke. He began to sob, the tear fell freely, and as he wept, he wondered what it was he truly wept for. Was it the lives he took, the effects of his actions, or was it for the brother that he lost? The brother that he had betrayed. The Theorin was never quite sure, and he hoped more than anything it was for Robb that he cried. It would at least prove that they had been true brothers once, and that it was not just something he had wished for. After some time he composed himself and threw some water on his face, and made his way to Sansa's room to wake her so they could break their fast. He knocked softly on the door, and when she opened it, it was clear she'd been crying too, both of them united in grief and traveling the same path. Though it was not the one that either of them would have wished. Many years earlier, when he was a brother by choice, there were times when he'd imagined what it would be like to be a brother. True, a foolish dream, and one that, like most of his dreams, was now lost in time. And yet, one that at times he'd remember fondly. He shook his head when Sansa looked at him oddly, and he knew he'd been doing it again, so he quickly spoke the first words that came to mind. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she said, giving him a warm smile, and he felt his heart beat that little bit faster, as it always did when she smiled at him that way. They walked to the large cabin, and Sansa took a seat amongst the men. Theon grabbed them both a plate of eggs and bacon, though only he truly ate from it. He was about to ask her to walk to the deck with her, when the shouting began, and as he looked to her and saw her looking nervously at him, he wished he had the words to reassure her, and found that he did not. Attack. We're under attack. To arms. Those words were much louder than his own, and so instead he took her hand and brought her below deck, seeking a place to hide her and finding to his horror that it was too late. The attack was successful and the ship had been taken. Looking at her, he took out his knife and made her the offer which she refused. His words of what may happen to her not having any effect, and he supposed that she felt if she could survive Ramsay, then she could survive anything. For him, he wasn't as certain, and yet he knew that she would be taken, and that, because of that, he needed to be taken too. So he removed his weapons and waited for the men to arrive, and when they did, he was almost glad to see they were usse. The blow was hard, and he was soon in darkness, and as his eyes closed, he began to wonder if he was to wake up this time, or if it was finally time to pay for his crimes. Eventually, he did wake only to find he was on a much different boat, and he was soon being dragged in front of an older man who looked at him curiously. What was more surprising, though, was seeing Sansa sitting at the men's table and drinking a glass of wine. A small smile on her face as she looked at him. Theon looked from her to the man, and then back again. He was confused and worried. And yet Sansa seemed to be almost unconcerned. "My men have been far too rough with you, Lord Tien. Please take a seat and accept my apologies." The man said, and Tien again looked from him to Sansa, and saw her nod. He rose to his feet, shakily, and took the offered seat, even drank the wine that the man poured for him, once he saw Sansa do the same. Once he felt his throat loosen up and that its dryness was gone, he readied to speak only for Sansa to do so first, her words making the situation all the more confusing to him. "The Theon, this is Triarch Malaquek. Megar, he's Talisa's father. Robb's good father, and he's going to help me take back my home," Sansa said before smiling beamingly. Dan smiled too. He felt he had to given how Malaquek was looking at him. As for the Triarch, while he too wore a smile, Dan felt it a false one, and he knew that whatever was going on here, it was not what Sansa believed it to be. He needed to speak to her, to talk some sense into her, even were this man not playing her false, which he was certain he was. It was madness to go up against Dany and Jon, and he feared that when next they saw them, neither would be so forgiving this time. During 305 AC, Axon, One of the big advantages of having dragons was the ability to fly away from those who annoyed you, and so despite bringing Daenerys with them to Dorne, Aegon would not be spending much time in the man's company on the way there. Instead, it would be Grey Worm and Chruno that were forced to put up with the cocky sellsword while he and Dany Seatty flew and stayed in the air and on land rather than on the ships. He knew that Shima, Jorah, and Brienne would worry, and yet they had no need to. They would sleep with their dragons and would be safer than even were they on a ship that was full of their men. The first night they stayed under the stars close to Storm's End, he, Dany, and all three of the dragon all happy to be together. Lord Yax more than any of them, enjoying being out in the open with both her big brothers and with him and Dany just as much. She could fly longer distances, and at times he allowed her to stretch her wings when Rhaegal and Drogon were flying slowly, but mainly she rode in front of him, perched on Rhaegal's back. They spent a night on the stepstones, and he knew that they would need to return here one day and take it for their own. Something that Dany seemed almost eager to do when he told her his reasons why. Essos would need to be conquered thoroughly, and that meant that the stepstones would need to be under their control, and so before they left the islands, they flew around them and looked them over. Without dragons, they'd be hard to take. With them, they would fall easily. And the next night, when they rested in Dorne, he spoke of it with Dany while they ate. "Do we really need to take them?" she asked as she ate her second meal. "Aye, we do. It has to be all or nothing, Dany. They may seem inconsequential compared to Miriam, Bravos, or Volantis, but they need to be under our control all the same," he said, as Lakos flew to lean against Rhaegal's side. "We are really going to take it all?" Dany asked. "It's what is needed to keep us safe and your people free, Dany," he said, and she smiled at him. "I didn't wish for this, Aegon. I had hoped that all our battles were done," she said, and he moved closer, allowing her to lean back against him. "We fight, so she doesn't have to," he said, and rubbed her stomach softly. "Are we not just setting the seeds for countless battles in the future?" she asked worriedly. "No, we're ending the need for war. The world we'll build won't need it, won't want it, and the men who do won't be around to seek it out," he said. And she looked at him. "I never thought you so ruthless, Aegon," she asked curiously. "I have much to lose, much to protect, and I am a dragon just like you. Like them," he said. And they both turned to watch as Lachax flew to Drogon, her bigger brother, moving his wings so that she could land closer to him. When he woke the next morning, it was after a strange dream, and he knew then that his original plans wouldn't hold. So he told Dany, and after they broke their fast, they then flew for longer than they had done so far. Over the deserts of Dorne and past Ghost Hill, the Tor and Yarrenwood, they rested that night near Skyreach, and the next morning flew some more, until he saw it in the distance. They were in the Prince's Pass, and though the tower no longer stood, it was clear that this was where it had once been. There were what looked to be 7, no 8 cairns on the ground beneath them, and he directed Rhaegal to land close to where the Tower of Joy had once stood. Once the dragon had done so, Aegon wasted little time climbing down off its back and moved quickly to where Drogon had landed so he could help Dany do likewise. Leorax flew and landed on the hill that overlooked the Red Mountains behind it, and he knew he'd be joining her there soon. "I had thought," he said as he saw where the red dragon had landed and where the tower had once stood. "It's gone?" Dany asked. "I, my uncle, never spoke much of this place, and Howland Reed only told me what happened here. But I believe those are the stones from the tower," he said, pointing to the cairns. "Are they graves, Aegon?" "They are. 5 Northmen, Sir Mark Ryswell, Ethan Glover, William Dustin, Theon Wool, and Martin Cassel, and 3 Kingsguard, Sir Garald Hightower, Sir Oswald Wind, and Sir Arthur Dane," he said softly, his voice fading, as he said the names. "Yakin," Dane said concernedly when she saw the angry look on his face. "My uncle was a damn fool, Dany, not content with keeping the truth from me. He then robs me of the chance to see it for myself, to see where she, he said, his angry tone quickly turning into something far different. "Aegon, please, my love," Dany said, and he felt her arms go around him, and he really needed them as he began to sob while she held him tight. His mother, his Kingsguard, and men who had come here to rescue what they had believed to be a kidnapped woman, all lost, and the tower where he'd been born just wiped away to be forgotten. No wonder his uncle never spoke of this place, and what had happened here. The shame of what he had done was too great. Was there no attempt to parley? No questions asked? Was his uncle a fool who cared not? other than for the fat stag he had named as a brother? What would his life have been like if his uncle had sought answers rather than vengeance? Or if he'd been a wolf rather than a damn stag? One day he hoped to be sent to the seven hells just so he could see Ned Stark again, so he could tell him what he thought of him and his damnable honor. He wanted to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what he felt for him, what he thought of him, not to ask him why, but so he knew that he was ashamed to name him as his kin. "I need to," he said softly, clearing his mind of such thoughts as Dany let him go. "I'll stay with the dragons," Doof said, kissing his lips softly before leaving him alone. He knelt down and offered a prayer to the gods for his mother, and then he moved to each of the cairns. They were unmarked, and he cursed his uncle once more, this time for leaving these men here, and for not even bothering to mark their graves. As he knelt down, though, he felt it, heard each of their names in his head as he prayed. Mark, Theo, Ethan, William, and Martin, and then Oswell, Gerald, and finally Arthur. At the last one he stayed a little longer than the others. This was his father's closest friend, the Sword of the Morning. The man his uncle had claimed to have killed after beating him in single combat, only for Howland Reed to later tell him the truth of things. "I wish I'd known you, all of you," he said sadly as he rose to his feet. They didn't stay there that night, instead flying a little way off and resting up at a small stream. The next morning they flew to the Bonway, Aegon telling Dantu to fly high and that they were just there to look and not attack. Yet there was nothing for them to attack, no army in sight, and when he landed, it was clear that no army had been here in some time. "Have they marched somewhere else?" Dany asked, confusedly. "They never marched here. They're either in Sunspear or they've sailed somewhere else," he said. "We should fly to Sunspear. We'd see them if they were there, wouldn't we?" she asked, and he nodded. When they flew over Sunspear, it was clear that they weren't there either. Quentyn had but a small force, and one that would easily fall. But still, it gave Aegon pause, so they landed a little nearer to the city than he had wished. So he could speak to his wife. "Where are they, Aegon?" Dany asked, and he looked at her unsure for once. "I don't know. They didn't sail towards King's Landing, or we'd have seen them." "Would they have sailed back to Essos?" "It makes no sense. We need to speak to Melora when we go back," he said, and Dany nodded. They arrived as the first of their ships was unloading at the bay. Egan, glad to see their own ship was amongst the first to dock. And no sooner had the dragons landed than the Drakengard and Tormund made their way to them. Later that day they spoke to Melora and she told them where the army was, and despite his first instinct being to fly to the north and set the ships alight, he knew he could not yet. Their work here had to be done, and so the north would need to wait. He only hoped that it didn't need to wait too long. It was as he slept that night, he saw the plan in his head, and he wondered if he really should follow it through. Dany had spoken to Arianne, and he knew that the princess, despite her own feelings, had realized that Quentyn had to die. Arianne just wasn't certain if that was to be before or after he spoke to him. Whatever course of action he ended up deciding, he knew one thing. He'd promised Dany he'd not risk himself, and this way would be no risk, at least not to his health, to his reputation. That may not be as true, and so the question he now asked himself was simple. Did his reputation really matter at the end of the day? Sunspear 305 AC. Ned Dane. Never even in the very worst of his nightmares did he think that he'd see an army surround Sunspear, especially one the size of this one. That he was part of said army, and not on the other side of it protecting the old palace and the Shadow City, was something that made him hate Quentyn Martell a little. Knowing that his aunt was somewhere in the old palace and basically a prisoner made him fearful, and yet as he watched the king and queen land on their dragons in front of them, he felt hopeful too. They'd beaten off an army of dead men, and though they had lost people doing so, it had been far less than anyone else could have, and they'd ensured that those who couldn't fight had been kept from harm. After that, they'd marched and taken King's Landing, facing a mad queen and the threat of wildfire, and had managed once again to do so without losing innocent lives. It made him believe that they would see his aunt safe, see the Shadow City and its inhabitants safe, and see Quentyn face the justice he deserved. He, Arianne, Daemon, and the Drakengard moved over to greet them. And he was relieved to see the look in the king's eyes. He looked determined and focused. Something they would need, as even knowing the full army wasn't here still left them with a tough task. Finding that out had been a huge shock to Arianne and the other Dornish lords. Not that they weren't in Sunspear, but that they'd sailed north. It had also led to worries that the king would abandon them. "How can they not be in the Bonway? Your Grace, did you fly at all, even the route there?" Arianne asked. "We did, Princess Arianne. They never went to the Bonway, whether that was always their plan or they played your brother false. we can only speculate on. The queen said, "Where have they gone, your grace?" Ned asked, looking to the king, who seemed deep in thought. "North. They've sailed to the north," the king replied. "Will you be heading north, your grace?" Aerion asked nervously. "In time, princess, in time. But not until Dorne is in the hands of its true ruler once more," the king said firmly. The doubt soon faded as the march had continued. Yet he knew each time the king and queen took to the skies, there were those among them who worried they'd not return. He wasn't one of them. He'd taken the measure of both of them in Winterfell, in King's Landing, and since they'd come to Dorne, and he knew they were good and true. They would see the city and Dorne itself back in Arianne's hands, and he believed that the king would come up with a plan to see his aunt safe. Given how he spoke of his uncle and the look in his eyes when he did so, he doubted there was a man other than himself who cared more for Illyria than Aegon Targaryen. With night falling, he was called to the command tent. Ned surprised to see the sellsword there given what everyone knew about him and how the king felt for him. To see the unsullied leader Grey Worm and Daemon there was no surprise, and as he looked around the tent he was surprised when he couldn't see Aegon and that only the queen, Princess Arianne, and the Sand Snakes were present. It didn't take too long for Aegon to arrive, though. Saw Jaime Lannister guarding his back like a shadow, and it made him wonder if his uncle would have looked the same had he lived. He knew he'd have been as dutiful and as diligent, but would he have worn the same expression on his face and moved the same way that Ser Jaime did? Was it a Kingsguard thing? The way the knight's eyes looked everywhere and nowhere at once, how he stood close enough to pull Aegon out of harm's way and yet far enough away so as he didn't crowd him or limit his movement. Had he need to pull his own blade? There was a difference in how Ser Jaime was compared to Ser Giara and Ser Brienne, and he wondered if that was down to the training that he, the Bold, and his uncle underwent when they were in the Kingsguard together. It made him smile to think so, to consider that, had his uncle lived, he'd be standing as Ser Jaime was and guarding the back of a good king. "Princess, my lords, good sirs, on the morrow will parley with Prince Quentyn and offer him terms," the king began. Though Arianne interrupted. "What terms, your grace?" "Surrender and keep his head, don't, and lose it," the king said simply and directly. "He'll not accept, your grace. Prince Quentyn was always too arrogant for his own good, and I'd imagine thinking himself the ruler of Dorne has only made him more so," Daemon said, and he saw the king nod before he looked to the queen. "We're well aware of the way arrogant men behave, Sir Daemon. We're counting on it," the queen said, and Ned looked at both her and the king curiously. "Lady Melora has found a way into the city, and the old palace, a way that, though it's guarded, is not as guarded as it should be. Grey Worm will lead a number of the Unsullied to secure this entrance, and when Quentyn comes to parley, he'll find the city being taken from behind him," the king said, and Ned smiled as he spoke. "You'll need men who know the city, your grace. Me and mine would offer ourselves," Ned said, and saw the king nod. "As would I, your grace," Sir Daemon said, and Ned saw both the look of worry on Arianne's face and the small frown on the king's. "I'm afraid we must decline, Sir Daemon. Were Prince Quentyn to not see you by Princess Arianne's side, then he'd be aware that something wasn't right," the king said, and Daemon nodded. "You'll need a man who is used to sneaking into cities, my queen," that sellsword said, and this time it was the queen who frowned, though the king smiled when he accepted. "Grey Worm has already requested your help, Naharis. I thank you for volunteering it before it was ordered," the king said, and Ned almost chuckled when he saw the way the sellsword bristled. "I'll go with them, your grace," Ser Jorah said, and once again the king shook his head. "The Dragon Guard needs to be seen just like Ser Daemon does, Ser Jorah," the king said, and the Lord Commander nodded his agreement. "My sisters and I will go, your grace," Sarah said, and he expected there to be pushback from the king, queen, or princess, and yet there was none. "Of course, Lady Sarah," the king said simply. They spoke of the signal, the dragons roaring, and once they did so, they were then to take as much of the palace as they could. There were almost 2,000 men in Sunspear under Quentyn's command, and he was stunned when the king handed them a map that showed where most of them were housed and based. Taking the old palace and holding it was more important, it seemed, than taking the city, the king telling them that once they did so, the rest would surrender. He seemed so confident of it that it made Ned question whether or not he knew something he did not, or it was just how he naturally was. Something that he questioned even more when he and the Sand Snakes were asked to join him and Grey Worm in the sands that overlook the city. Your Aunt Ned, she's been held with the other ladies in what used to be the chambers that Lady Ilaria and Prince Oberyn's other daughters were housed in. The king said, looking to Sorella, Obella, and Ilia. We know it well, your grace, my sisters, and I will lead Lord Dane to it, Sorella said. I have a strange request of you, Lord Dane, and you, my ladies, the king said, and Ned watched as the king held out his hand, and a small white bird landed on it. Take her with you and let her fly. Listen to her. Follow her, and she'll lead you away from any trouble. Ned watched as the king moved his hand, and Sorella took the bird. The small little chirps that it made were almost melodic in the night sky. You are a warg? Sorella asked excitedly. I am, but it won't be me controlling her, the king said, and Sorella laughed. They stood quietly for a moment, almost as if none of them knew what to say, and it was only that they needed to leave and make their way to the city that ended up shattering the peaceful silence that had descended upon them. We must make ready, he said, and saw Grey Worm nod to the king, and Sorella, Elia, and Obella turn to walk away. I wish you all good fortune on the morrow, the king said, looking to them. Then surprised to see some worry on his face, and it took him a moment to realize it was concern and not worry that he was showing. You too, your grace, he said to a nod, and as he walked back down the hill, he saw the king and Saragami look out onto the sands. Sunspear 305 AC. Quentin. It was like something out of his worst nightmares, the sheer mass of men that surrounded the city almost making him panic and run. How did they get here? Where was Malakwo? What was he to do? That his men were panicking too. Didn't help matters either, and were it not enough to see Dothraki, Unsullied, and more Dornishmen than he had ever seen gathered in one place, there were the dragons too. Huge, enormous, lethal-looking dragons who could burn him, his men, the entire city down, and not even tire when doing so. When he first heard about them, he had laughed it off, thinking it nothing but a strange tale from Essos. Considering all the strange tales that were told in that place, he'd assumed it was just the same thing, and that even were they to be real then, they'd be small, tiny, misshapen things, like the ones in the dragon pit had been years before. Everyone had heard the tale of how the last dragons were small and misshapen and could barely breathe smoke, let alone fire. In Dorne tales like that were welcomed and spoken of just as fondly as tales of Meraxes and Rhaenys and how Dorne had brought them both down low. Over time he'd believed in them more and more. The tales were too frequent, the stories too certain. He'd thought to take one for his own, to present himself to Daenerys Targaryen, and offer her Dorne's spears and his own. He thought with a wry smile, and to take her and a dragon for himself. It was not to be. Fate, life, the will of the gods. Sheer bad luck. All of it set him off on another path, and when he finally did see the dragons, they were long gone, and far out to sea. Seeing them now as they flew over his city, his palace, made him fearful just as much as seeing the army that surrounded them. Where the fuck is Malakwo? He shouted to no one in particular. He hurried back inside and made his way to find his men. It didn't take him too long to do so. Jairus and Archibald were almost running to him, both men wearing the same panicked looks on their faces that he was. They quickly moved to one of the rooms where they'd not be overheard or disturbed. It was one thing to show his fear amongst men who knew and trusted him as much as these two did, quite another to do so with the men of the Windblown. Them he'd won through courage, and ending the tattered prince. Their loyalty was not so sure as Jairus or Archibald's was. My prince, what happened? Archibald asked. Was Malakwo beaten? Surely not so soon, Jairus said. I believe we've been betrayed. Malakwo, either through his own plans or acting on Bellacois, has abandoned us. Were I to guess, I'd say he's left us here as a distraction, Quentin said. What are we to do, my prince? We cannot beat the forces against us, and were they to set the dragons against the palace, then we're done for, Archibald said. We all heard tales of Daenerys Targaryen in Essos, of how she cares this bastard king of hers may or may not be the same, but the suffering of innocence will stay the Dragon Queen's hand. Quentin said with a smirk, What of your sister, my prince? Jairus asked. The whore is far easier to control, he said with a chuckle. That they didn't attack that day wasn't a great surprise. Instead, they simply surrounded the city, and were he not already clear that he could not beat them conventionally, then it didn't take him or the Windblown long to understand it. Yet he feasted and feasted well. He laughed and japed, and as he looked around the room he knew that it was with those in here that he'd win the day. Not the men, not the soldiers, but the ladies. Ellaria Dane, Enos, Ironwood, and Damon Sands' whore of a mother, They would see his sister broken and see Daenerys Targaryen give him what was his by right. The wine flowed and he drank it happily. Quentyn had already spoken to the windblown, and both Garrus and Archibald had spread word that all was in hand. Men won battles, not just numbers, but men, smart men, clever men, men who were willing to do what other men would not. On the morrow, he'd show the dragons and Dorne that he was such a man. Tonight he'd drink, celebrate, and enjoy himself. When he woke, his head hurt, his throat was dry, and the girl beside him was unknown to him. She looked like a servant, but could very well be a whore, and he didn't even remember taking her to his bed. He got up and walked to the privy, relieving himself before he ended up drinking down the mug of water and pouring himself another. Looking to the window, he could see the sun had already risen, and so he quickly dressed before leaving the girl still sleeping in his bed and making his way to break his fast. Once he did so, he sent for Jairus and Archibald, and then spent the early part of the morning sparring before setting up where he wished his men to be. "When will the seek to parley, my prince?" Archibald asked. "Midday, I'd expect," he replied. "You're sure this will work, my prince?" Jairus said. "It will, the ladies are prepared." "They are." "Good, then we wait," he said, as they strolled through the old palace almost as if they'd not a care in the world, and there wasn't an army larger than any in Dorne's history at their gates. He was right about the timing, too. A little before noon, the rider arrived under the flag of parley, and Quentyn made ready to ride out to meet the queen, the king, and his whore of a sister. Turning to Archibald, he gave him the nod to make ready the surprise, wondering how Daenerys, Daemon, Ned Dane, the Dornish lords, and Arianne would react to the threats he was about to make. Would he have to actually kill one of them, or would they accept his word that he would? He cared not. If need be, he had no problem with cutting a woman's throat. Far better it be hers than his, after all. Sunspear 305 AC. Tormund. He'd gone beyond the wall and seen his people settled, and almost as soon as he'd done so, he'd wished to be elsewhere. The truth of things was he'd missed being with his friend, missed laughing with him, and he especially missed the fighting alongside him. Life was no fun unless you were fighting or fucking. The big woman, though, had put paid to the fucking. For now, at least. So he'd made his way back to Winterfell, and found that the miserable crow had been left in charge and not the sister that hated Jon. It was an odd, strange world he found himself living in when even a crow was better than a wolf to hold a keep. Yet despite it all, he liked the miserable fucker just a little. Ed had fitted him out with supplies, given him a horse, and along with some men they'd then ridden to the home of the Fat Lord. Tormund finding the city to be a strange place where people ate, drank, and never seemed to hunt. He'd been welcomed friendly enough, though. The Fat Lord knowing he was a friend of Jon's and telling him that they'd marched and would have taken the city by now. Of course he would. What city can stand to the little crow, the Dragon Queen, and their mighty beasts, he said with a laugh, though the Fat Lord didn't laugh with him at first. He is king now, Tormund. Not just in the north, but in the Seven Kingdoms. There are those who won't like hearing you name Aegon as such, the Fat Lord said. Who the fuck is this Ekin? He asked, confused. Jon's name is Aegon Targaryen. Tormund, the Fat Lord said, as if that meant something to him. Tormund looking even more confused at him for a moment until he remembered that the queen was a Targaryen too. Like the Dragon Queen? He asked. Aye, she's his aunt, the Fat Lord said. Thank the gods she's not his sister, he said, and laughed loudly. One sister fucker was enough to know in this lifetime. He'd not stayed too long in the Fat Lord's city, though he hadn't enjoyed the journey by ship, and had spent most of it losing whatever he put in his stomach, almost as soon as he did so. Something he did again when he reached the city that Jon and the Dragon Queen called their home. Now, too, the smell not something he had expected. Seeing his friend again was worth it, though, and finding out that he'd arrived just as they were about to fight once more only made it even better. He didn't get to spend as much time with him as he wished on the journey to where the fight would take place. Jon and the Dragon Queen taking to the air far more than they did the sea. It was only when they landed in this god-forsaken place that he'd wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The heat, not something he was used to, and the fact that Jon took the piss out of him constantly didn't make him feel much better either. Take off the damn furs, Tormund, Jon said as they rode through the sands. You want me to ride naked? He said, shaking his head as the Dragon Queen laughed. No, though perhaps if I sent you to the gate of Sunspear that way, they'd all surrender in their fear at the size of your member. Jon said to laughs, his own included. Better than sending you to do the same. Little Crow, if people saw the truth of what you had in your britches, they'd not fear you as much as they should, he said, looking to the Queen, and wiggling his eyebrows, making her laugh even louder still. "When we stop, we'll get you some new clothes. You look like you're about to fall off your horse." Jon said, and he nodded at him, happy for the words and the man who spoke them, even if it meant he had to suffer this heat. He liked the nights as the air was cool and the wine flowed. Tormund soon finding that he liked the one they drank here far more than the one he'd tried in the Fat Lord City. Sitting in the tents or out in the open as they ate and drank, he noticed it more and more. The differences in how Jon was now that he was Aegon Targaryen were even more apparent. That he and the Dragon Queen were even closer than they had been was clear, as was the fact that they'd soon be welcoming a babe, something that Jon told him as they stood looking out on the sands one night. "I'm to be a father, Tormund. Dany is to have a babe," Jon said. "It pleases you?" he asked. "It does. It worries me too. I don't want to fight, Tormund, yet it seems it's the life I must live if I want my babe to grow up in a world where they don't have to. Beyond the wall, that was what I wished for. What we all wished for. Thanks to you and the Dragon Queen, there are people there who will know such a life," he said softly. "I find I envy them, for my own is not to be that way and won't be for some time. This is not the only fight we have, Tormund, here, Essos. We'll be fighting for years to come." "Good. Life's fucking boring when you don't fight. Or fuck, you're fucking enough, right?" he said to a laugh. "Good. Then you don't need my help with that, so I'll help you with the fighting instead," he said, slapping his back. "I'm glad you came, Tormund, that you're with me." Jon said, the look on his face one he'd not seen before. "Life's fucking boring without you, little crow," he said, and heard Jon laugh as he made his way back to his end, the Dragon Queen's tent. The clothes he wore were fucking ridiculous looking, and when the sister fucker suggested he shave his beard, he almost gutted him. When Jon suggested that the big woman may like him more if he did so, he almost considered it, though in the end, he couldn't bring himself to do so. Him without his beard, he may as fucking well be naked, which given the clothes he wore, he was beginning to feel that he was. This material was soft, light, and way too fucking colorful. Not even the leather armor he wore underneath it, making him feel as if he was wearing anything at all. He almost growled at the Dragon Queen when she told him that he looked handsome and that yellow was truly his color. That Jon, the sister fucker, the bear knight, and the big woman all laughed when she did so, only annoying him even more. Still, later on, as he stood with the other men in the same colors as they readied for the frog to come to speak to them, he did at least feel cooler than he had. When he saw them arrive, he looked to Jon and saw him nod and he readied for the signal, Tormund soon finding himself wondering what it would feel like to fight in such clothes. Sunspear 305 AC. Dany. As important as she knew retaking Dorne was, it was hard for her to concentrate on it. Daenerys instead, finding her mind filled with thoughts of the army that was headed to the north and with what had happened in Meriden. She was relieved that Akshan was taking on so much of the planning for dealing with Quentyn Martell and that he didn't seem worried about the north, though she knew that on that point it was more that her husband had been able to separate one from the other, something she herself couldn't truly do. Aegon had explained his thought process to her. How they had to deal with this first, and once they had, they could then deal with the north before moving on to Essos. He said it was how he had managed to think about fighting against the Night King and preparing the north for that fight. That he had known the fight was coming and that he had time to prepare for it, and so his mind had allowed him to not worry as much about the what-ifs of that fight. She had tried to do the same thinking about Meereen, tried to think not on the things she couldn't actually do anything about, and more on the things she could, and she had found she could not. In some respects, it had made her and Princess Arianne more similar than her and Aegon, both of them thinking of the people they were responsible for, and the fact that they were suffering under someone they needed to deal with, rather than as Aegon was, the possibility of that suffering, that her husband was able to almost forget about things and offer her comfort too, also helped her greatly, something he was doing now as they lay in their bed in their tent, and he spoke softly to both dragons that were there with them. "It's cold and full of snow, but it's beautiful too." "Aye, of course. I want you to see it," Accident said, and though he was speaking to the babe in her belly, Lord Jax listened and watched him intently as he spoke. "Yay, I miss it, but it's not the home it used to be for me. That's wherever you are, wherever your mother is. Not someplace. It's with her, with you, and with your brothers." She smiled at that. He'd told her it before, but hearing him say it to both their little dragons only made his words even more true. It was something she believed as much as he did, too. Home wasn't a place. It wasn't Dragonstone, the Red Keep, Winterfell, Meereen, or even a house with a red door. Home was wherever her family was, where her dragons and Aegon were, where Missandei, Grey Worm, Davos, and even where Arya Stark was. When you're here, we'll all fly together, little dragon. Lyax wishes it just as much as your mother and I do, Agag said, and Dany giggled when the red dragon chirped loudly. Your mother does too, even if she is a mummer who pretends to be sleeping, Aegon said, and she laughed fully. Then, when he looked from her stomach to her face, I couldn't help myself, she said, laughing still, and she almost couldn't breathe. So truly did she laugh when Lyrax made what she swore was a disgruntled chirp. When she calmed down and wiped the tears from her eyes, the happy, joyful tears that she'd shed as she laughed harder than she had in some time, she looked to see Aegon move Lyakhos to the corner of the tent. The red dragon was too big to truly sleep with them anymore. She was almost the size of Ghost and even bigger when she spread her wings. Yet she was a babe truly and wasn't yet ready to be away from either of them. Though soon she'd be sleeping with her brothers and flying with them even more than she did now. Once the red dragon was settled, Aegon began to remove his clothing, placing it beside his armor as he finally joined her in bed properly. How long were you awake? He asked her as he put his arm on the pillow for her to rest, her head on, and snuggle up against him. A while. I find it brings me peace to see and hear you talk to our little dragon, she said softly. Both of them, he said with a chuckle, and she nodded. She is so eager to see her. I worry what that will be like when she comes. Dany said, and Aegon turned to look at her. She's soft and gentle when she wishes, Dany. Though she's growing, she's careful when she moves. When I speak to our babe, or when I touch your stomach, Lord Yax does so at times too. Gods, it's like nothing I've ever seen before. I think that only Ghost can move so softly and without noise, Axon said, his smile, beaming. You don't fear her with our babe? She asked. Never? Remember how Drawn and Rhaegal were when first we brought Leox to see them? How they moved with so much care, and how they were when you knew you were with child for true? He asked. She did remember it, both of them taking ever so much care to not hurt their little sister, and when Drogon and then Rhaegal moved their snouts against her belly, she barely felt them as they did so. Aegon was right on this, and she knew she really didn't have anything to fear when it came to Ghost or the dragons with their babe. Perhaps it was more simply the fear of the world she was bringing her into that preyed on her mind. How can we protect her, Aegon? From wars, from the fights we must have. How do we keep her safe? She asked, worriedly. Aegon turning to face her and holding her tightly against him. We end any who would ever threaten her. Dany, without thought, without mercy. If they are a danger to our babe, then they die, he said firmly. How do we know when to stop? She asked softly. We'll know. Melora is a servant of the old gods, Dany, the true three-eyed raven, and Kinvora serves the red one. We are their chosen, you and me. Us, Raxley. We are the beginning of our house. They seek us to rise, to be safe, and yet I care not other than I know they're on our side. We won't be cruel or indiscriminate, but we will see Westeros righted and then see Essos righted, and she will know peace, even if for some time all we'll know is war. She kissed him deeply, and as always the moment she did so, her cares and worries began to be replaced by the comfort and surety she felt when she was with him. It was something that he had told her that he too felt, that being with her, laying with her, be it when they did many things or simply as they lay together in each other's arms, that was when his own worries and cares fell away also. Later, as he slept and she did not, she looked down on his face and watched as he dreamt, and she wondered if he was dreaming the same things she did most nights. They would be older, Rosia and her brothers would play in front of them, and they would do so with dragons flying in the air. Their house was as strong as it had ever been, and they were at peace, safe, and together. How they got there was not something she cared much about. Only that they got there. The North 305 AC. Malakau? When they had seen the ship in the distance, his first thought had been to ignore it. Then, for some reason, he had the desire to take it, almost as if some voice inside him told him that he must. So he'd given the order, and it had fallen quickly. And once again, that voice changed his mind about what he was going to do. He had planned for them all to die. Perhaps he'd have allowed his men to take their frustrations out on the girl before they threw her and her companion overboard. But the voice said no, speak to her, get to know her, and then decide. So he had, and how he'd kept his cool when he found out who they had captured, was something that even now, days later, he couldn't answer. Of all the people he could have met on his way to the north, His fate was to meet an actual Stark, the sister of the very man who had cost him his daughter. How she lived still. Only the gods knew, because each time he looked at her, spoke to her, and had to suffer her presence was a time too much. That the girl actually thought herself to be in control of the situation was laughable, and why he allowed her to think so was something he couldn't understand or explain. Were she another person and not a member of the family that he had come here to end? Then he'd put it down to learning as much about his enemy as he could, to using her to secure his victory or to lay the ground for such, or to simply keeping her alive in case she was of use to him. But she was a Stark, a wolf, and that should have been enough to see her in pain. It should have been enough to see her dead. That he spent each night imagining how he'd make her suffer, thinking of the things he'd see done to her before he took her life, was no substitute from seeing it done, and yet each day she lived still. "Send for the girl," Malako said to his guard as he poured himself the glass of wine and took out his pouch with the leaves inside. He bit down on one of them and drank the wine down quickly, feeling his calm come over him once more, and glad he'd brought a decent supply of them with him. Even with the voice, he'd found he needed them. The calm they brought him, something he had been grateful for ever since the news had come about. Talisa's death. Without them, he'd give in to his rage, his anger, and at times he had and would do so again. When he ended this girl, when he took her brother's life and saw her sister dead, when he put Winterfell and the North to the sword, then he'd give in to his rage. For now, he needed to be calm, and as he saw the door open, he welcomed the feeling that came over him. "My lady, I'm so pleased that you could join me. Some wine?" he asked, the smile on his face looking far truer than it really was. "Thank you, Triarch," the redhead said as she took her seat, her own smile calculating and practiced. "Malako, Lady Sansa," he said, pouring her the wine and then moving the glass towards her. "Malako," she said, not offering him the same courtesy, the smile still on her face and still not reaching her eyes. He briefly wondered if all the women of Westeros were as ridiculous as this one. Was it a trait amongst them to think themselves far cleverer than they were, or was it just Sansa Stark? It would explain why her brothers had taken women raised in Essos for their wives rather than those from their homeland. Though he tried not to dwell on that and certainly didn't pull too much on the thread when images of Talisa came to his mind. "This Wintertown, Lady Sansa, your family's keep. Are you sure they'll surrender without a fight?" he asked. "Winterfell," she said, her smile fading, and he tried not to chuckle, especially since he'd made his mistake on purpose. "Winterfell. Forgive me, Lady Sansa, being from Essos. I find the names in Westeros to be most confusing," he said, and she nodded, though the look in her eyes said this was not a immune who knew how to forgive. "It will, Malako. Not only is the force you bring with you far more than they could hold out against, it is, as you say, my family keep," she said as she reached forward and took the wine glass in her hand, taking a small sip before placing it back on the table. "And with me by your side, then, they'll be more than happy to accept the offer I make them," she said, smiling. A truer one this time. "And the North?" he asked. "Is mine by birthright, Malako? After the terrible act that was done to my brother and to your daughter, it then fell to me to be the Lady of Winterfell, and to rule the North, and though I never wished for it, I accepted it with grace. Only for my bastard brother to steal it from me," she said angrily. Is this Jon Snow that you've spoken of?" he asked, and she nodded. "And you say you believe that he played a role in my daughter and Goodson's deaths?"
"I do, Malako."
"I truly do," she said, shaking her head as if it pained her to say such a thing. "The more thought I've given it, the more it's come to me that it can only be true. Then together we'll see him pay for what he did to our kin," Malako said, and he watched as she took the wine glass in her hand, her smile true once more as she sipped and savored the wine and accepted another glass once she was done. The girl was vain, bitter, and a fool, telling him a ridiculous story of how a bastard brother had conspired with their enemies to see Robb Stark brought low so that he could take their home from them. How he'd then allowed their other brother to die so there would only be her claim to stand against her own, and then had tricked the northern lords with tales of an enemy that only he had beat. She painted herself a victim and told of how she had risen and won the lords to her side with the truth, only for her bastard brother to align himself with the Dragon Queen so that he could take it all from her again. It was a story that only a deluded fool would believe, and though he wasn't aware of the full truth of Jon Snow or Aegon Targaryen as he was named now, he knew it wasn't this. Still, it served him well enough, and so he allowed her to speak her tale, and he performed a mummery as if he believed it. In time, he'd show her what he truly thought of her. For now, he'd allow her to think herself in control. Sansa Stark could play the damsel in distress. She could think she controlled the game and that she'd found a friend in him. Perhaps he'd even see her live long enough to think she had won before he took her head from her shoulders. Perhaps not, as they sat in the cabin smiling at each other and drinking the wine. For the first time, they both wore true smiles at the same time, though for vastly different reasons. "Land Triarch. The north is in sight," his guard said after knocking and coming into the cabin when he was bid. "Shall we, Lady Sansa?" he said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "I thank you, Malaklo," she said as he nodded and led her from the cabin. Sunspear 305. Diario. Things had not developed how he had expected. His queen wasn't best pleased to see him, though on that he couldn't blame her. He had lost her city after all. Not even his reasoning for why he'd come had seemed to bridge the divide that caused, and it wasn't only Daenerys that wasn't pleased with him about Meryn's fall. Jorah Mormont, Grey Worm, and Missandei, all making it clear to him that they'd have preferred to see him fall with the city than to come to them to explain its loss. He expected if the dwarf was around, then he'd have blamed him too, though he was happy to find that he too had found disfavor with the queen and had run in fear of her fury. That he'd found disfavor with the man she had married had been something he'd counted on, though not on the man himself nor how his queen looked to him. Aegon Targaryen was no Hisdar, that was for sure, and yet he had found him lacking in height, looks, and in what he had assumed to be prowess with a blade, though on that last one he no longer did. That he'd not fought him may have been to his good fortune, as seeing him spar with those he did so was enough to give him pause. Still, he'd tried and found the man had some mettle to him, something about him, and it made his task that very much harder. He was a dragon rider, in more ways than one, if his queen wasn't just speaking it because she was still angry at him. The white wolf he controlled too, somehow, and though Dario didn't truly believe the tales people spoke of him in battle, he wasn't as sure of them not being true as he had been at first. He was also the father of the babe that grew in his queen's belly and that most of all raised questions. How? Why? Why him and not Dario? How had he managed to give her something that she wanted more than anything in the world when he could not? Only a dragon can love a dragon. The words took on more meaning now that not only had they brought another dragon into the world, but soon they'd be bringing in the one in to ride it. He'd thought long and hard about what to do as they had sailed to take this place back for his queen. He'd considered many options. A knife in the dark, an arrow in the back, turning on him if they managed to fight together side by side. Even selling him out should he get the opportunity, and in the end, he'd discarded them all. He needed him to fall and his queen not to mourn him if he was to have any chance to be with her. As it was right now, she loved Aegon far too much and him falling wouldn't do anything for him. He needed to see him sullied in her eyes first. He just didn't know how to see that done. "We move," he heard Grey Worm say. And he looked up to see the bird in the air before he turned to look at the men around him. He almost found himself lost for a moment before he realized that they were attacking the guards and had made their way to the palace, and he wasn't still back in his tent. Shaking his head clear of the thoughts that he'd been having some variation of for the past few days, he checked to make sure his Eric and his lady were on his hips, and then nodded when Grey Worm gave him the signal. He, Grey Worm, the young Dornish lord, and the Dornish women moved quickly, giving the guards no chance, Dario slitting the throat of the man nearest to him and then throwing his lady to kill the one furthest away. It was over in a matter of moments. The guards were dead and the path into the palace itself was now open to them. "You six, move the bodies and take their positions," the young Dornish lord, Ned something or other said, and he heard Grey Worm send some of the Unsullied back to bring the rest of their men through. Almost 400 men would take the palace, 300 of them unsullied, and he pitied the poor fools who'd stand in their way. These men would be no match for the spears and quick movement of the men that came to do his queen's bidding. Even without the element of surprise, the battle was tilted in their favor. With it, it was a foregone conclusion. He wasn't even truly needed here, and had only offered himself so that he'd regain some of the favor he lost. Dario knew, though, that until they had retaken Meereen, it would not truly be granted to him. In some ways, he was beginning to welcome that, as it would take him at least that long to figure out how to separate the queen from her husband. He only hoped that the man didn't fall before he did so. He leaned up against the wall and drank the water from his pouch. Grey Worm stood a few feet in front of him as stoic and as quiet as ever. The young Dornish lord could be an Unsullied himself given how little he spoke. Even his attempts to speak to the Dornish women had fallen on deaf ears, and he was getting more and more bored as they waited. Had something happened? Something went wrong. Was the queen safe? She must be. The dragons would have made noise had something happened to her. Wouldn't they? Looking up to the sky, he could see the sun was beaming down and the bird was flying and almost hovering above them. It was growing close to midday, and he took another swig of the water before putting the top back on the pouch and tying it back to his side. What if he began to say. The roars were loud, and as one they moved, Daenerys' arak in his hand as they entered the palace, and it was as he did so that he began to recognize some of the men. Why were the wind blown here? And where was the tattered prince? If he had time to think on it, then it would have given him pause. As it was, there was no time to think in a fight, and so his arak did his thinking for him. He saw men recognize him too, and one or two spoke his name as their last words. Though more and more simply died without speaking a word as Grey Worm and the Unsullied went about their work quietly and efficiently as always. "Fuck, she's not here," he heard the young Dornish lord say. And then he heard him tell Grey Worm and the others to stand down when faced with men who weren't sworn to the windblown. An hour, perhaps even less than that, was all it took to take the palace, and though he couldn't count how many they'd killed, he was sure it was more than half the windblown that had fallen. As for their own losses, there were some, but only 2 Unsullied had fallen, and they'd lost more Dornish men than the Queen's own. Daddario smiling at that, as it showed these Westerosi for what they truly were. They were weaker, inferior, less trained, and less skilled than the men of Essos, men such as him. He only wished he could say the same thing for the man of Westeros that stood in his way, and held his queen's heart. Sunspear 305 AC. Arianne. She had barely slept and woke up at various points during the night. Thankful that she didn't wake Daemon when she did so. When dawn broke, she could bear it no longer, and so she rose and dressed. Daemon quickly joining her as she walked around the camp. For some reason, Arianne found herself looking to the king and queen's tent, to the guards outside, and it comforted her knowing that it was only her that seemed nervous about what was to happen later that day. Iaxon and Daenerys had told her their plan to take the city. The men had been sent, and she was glad that Ned Dane and men from Dorne were among them, and that the queen had sent the leader of the Unsullied too. Daemon had reassured her that the plan was sound, and she hoped that it was, as she felt that their parley with Quentyn would not be. Her brother was too proud, too stupid, and too bitter to understand the situation he was in, and Arianne feared he'd do something stupid and cause more death than there needed to be. So much so that she was willing to let him leave, to give him safe passage from Dorne, though once he was back in Essos, she'd do everything in her power to see him dead. They reached the hill, and she looked down over Sunspear. The sun was rising up behind the city, and she closed her eyes and began to pray. To the father, the mother, the smith, warrior, maiden, and the crone, and finally, to the stranger, she offered up her prayers that today would go well, and that those she cared about and her people would be safe. When she opened her eyes, it was to see the dragons in flight, both of them looking fierce, and she hoped that it was the image of them and the possibility of what they could do, rather than the truth of them that she'd see this day. "All will be well, princess," Daemon said, and she welcomed his arms around her and the soft kiss he placed on her neck. "I wish to wed Daemon when we've seen Dorne to rights. I wish to wed," she said, and she didn't need to turn her head to know there was a smile on his face. "Then we shall be wed, my princess," he said, and she smiled too, relaxing as he held her. They stayed like that for some time, and then made their way back to the camp, a guard stopping them along the way and bidding them join the king and queen as they broke their fast. She could hear it when she reached the tent. The king's laughter and the queen's mock annoyance at something he said, and it comforted her that they were calm where she was not. Entering the tent, she saw the source of that laughter as the king spoke to the red dragon, and the queen looked on. Aegon on his knees as the dragon chirped, and she couldn't help but listen in. "You truly wish to act my guard," Aegon said to a loud chirp. "Don't you want to fly with your brothers?" A different chirp which brought a smile to the queen's face. "Very well. I'll tell Sierra May that he has another dragon guard today," Aegon said, and the red dragon chirped. What she was sure now was a happy sound. "Princess Arianne, Ser Daemon, please join us and ignore my husband and his morning follies," the queen said, and Arianne smiled as she took his seat. "I am simply listening to someone wiser than me. Isn't that what you ask of me often?" "My love," Aegon said, and she swore he winked at her, and Daemon as he took his seat beside the queen. "I meant me, Aegon, not Daenerys," the queen said, as if she was put out. "Then I misunderstood when you told me to listen to the dragon. Forgive me, my queen." Rosier zen with mock sincerity, and Arianne heard the red dragon chirp when Aegon turned to it and rolled his eyes. Aegon Targaryen, you did not just do that. The queen said, slapping the king lightly, and Arianne found herself smiling broadly as she watched them interact. Outside the tent, men were ready to line up, as if to attack, and inside Sunspear, Ned Dane, Grey Worm, and the Unsullied made ready to take the old palace from her brother's men. Yet were anyone to simply see inside the tent, then they'd have no idea that a battle may take place this day. It calmed her greatly, and she enjoyed the meal more so than she had any since she'd found out what Quentyn had done. Once she was finished eating and they spoke together for some time, she made her way back to her tent, and both she and Daemon dressed properly for the parley to come. Her clothes were now more to make a statement than for comfort, and the dress she picked was in her house's colors. Arianne then placing the crown on her head, she was glad she'd brought it with her, as it would send a message to any who saw it. She was the Princess of Dorne, and Quentyn was merely a mummer, a liar, a usurper, and a man with no honor. "Shall we, Princess?" Daemon said, and she nodded, following him outside the tent, and making her way to where they would parley. Her good humor lasted until she saw the horses ride her way, and saw her brother leading the men, and once she did, she felt her anger begin to rise. She closed her eyes and looked to the sky, happy when she then saw them in the distance. She looked to the 3 members of the Dragon Guard who stood to one side, and, as her brother drew closer, she smiled. The dragons were on her side. And this day would end with her and with Quentyn in their rightful places. Sunspear 305 AC. Aegon Targaryen. After Arianne and Daemon left, he helped Dany get ready, Aegon fitting the armor to her himself and tying it so that it was secure. Once he was sure that she was well protected, he moved to put his own on, and then he looked to the 2 swords. A part of him wished to take Blackfyre with him today, and yet he knew that it was Longclaw that he needed. Laughing to himself, he stood with both in his hands, and for a moment he imagined himself wielding them together. Something he quickly shook from his thoughts before strapping Longclaw to his hip. He opened the tent cover, and Lyarex flew to join her brothers, Aegon nodding to Dany, and then both of them walked out together. Ser Jorah, Ser Brienne, and Ser Jaime walked with them. The Dragon Guard all well aware of their roles today, and he looked to see Tormund standing and looking uncomfortable in his new clothes. Aegon resisted the urge to smile at his friend's discomfort, instead nodding to him and welcoming the nod he got back. He would be ready when he needed him, and he was grateful for that, though it was simply his presence that brought him true comfort. "You all know your roles. I'll say nothing more than what I already have. Be ready and do your duty," he said to the Dragon Guard, and saw them nod. "You're sure about this, Aegon?" Dane said, and he leaned forward and kissed her cheek. "I am. You heard what Lady Melora said yourself, Dany. This is what needs to be done," he said, and she nodded as they reached the dragons. He spoke briefly to Rhaegal, and then looked to Lyarex. The red dragon would be flying with her brothers today, and not on Rhaegal's back. Instead, she'd fly beside them, and he could feel her excitement and eagerness for the flight to begin. Looking to Dany, he saw she was already on Drogon's back, and so he hurriedly climbed up onto Rhaegal's, his wife giving the order, and all 3 dragons quickly taking to the air. They flew over the sea for a little bit, the Khan watching as Lyaxa dropped down into the water and came up with a fish in her mouth before flipping it in the air, hitting it with her flames and catching it as it fell. He'd not seen her do so before, and as he closed his eyes, Rosiagle showed him how he and Drogon had been teaching their sister what it meant to be a dragon. Thanking his son, they flew higher, and though it was far slower than the dragons could fly, it was still faster than Lyaxa. Until now, Khan knew that both he and Dany would need to praise her later on this day, as she was eager to show them all she could now do. Eventually, it was time, and when he saw the horses ride out from Sunspear, he directed Rhaegal and Lyarex to land, the dragons landing in front of Quentyn and his men and close to where the Dragon Guard stood. Once they'd reached them, Dany and he climbed off, and the 2 larger dragons took to the sky. Lyarex did too, but she flew only a few feet above their heads as they made their way to where Arianne, Daemon, and her guards stood waiting. Behind them, Hano and his men rode, making a big show of things, and he looked to see where Tormund stood with their own men, smiling when he saw him. By the time they reached Arianne and the others, Quentyn had arrived, and it was then he saw it, the large smile on the man's face, letting him know that Melora was right. "Prince Quentyn," Dany said as Aegon looked to the men to see what it was that the prince had up his sleeve. Melora had warned them that it was something, but she hadn't known exactly what it was. "Bring Daenerys." "King Aegon, sister," Quentyn said cockily as he dismounted from his horse. and how he said the last word made his feelings for Arianne clear. "I'll not bother with pleasantries, Prince Quentyn. Our army can take the city. We could, and we'll see you and every single one of your men dead. And those who don't fall immediately will wish they had." Aegon said, looking to the men who lined up behind the prince, and noticing 4 at the back who seemed to be surrounding something or someone. "You could, yet you won't," Quentyn said cockily, and Aegon closed his eyes as Dany spoke to the man. He looked through Rhaegal's eyes as words were spoken. Quentyn daring to give his queen terms and asking Dany for his sister's head, saying that he'd serve as Prince of Dorne and under their rule just as well as Arianne would. Aegon tuned out the words as best he could. The angered shouts from Arianne fading away, and then he saw them, and he knew what it was that Quentyn had up his sleeve. There was no need for him to hear Quentyn name them as Ned Dane's aunt, or Daemon Sand's mother, or as the mother of one of the other Dornish lords. Aegon, now glad he'd not allowed for any of them to sit this parley, as he'd not be sure he could control what the lord in question may do. Instead, he simply told Rhaegal what he wished, and to tell his brother to help. "The guards, Rhaegal, just the guards," he said softly. Opening his eyes, he turned to see where everyone was and what was being said. Happy to see Ser Jorah and Ser Brienne both standing so close to Dany. Looking to them and to Ser Jaime, who stood close to him, he nodded to them and to Tormund, and then he raised his hand before dropping it quickly. In the air, Drogon and Rhaegal roared as they then swooped from the sky. The men guarding the women moved not to them, but away from them, when they realized the dragons were coming their way. The arrows flew, Hanno and his men firing them from horseback, and the men around Quentyn quickly began to fall. Ser Jorah and Ser Brienne moved in front of Dany, swords drawn and ready to be used should they be needed. Tormund and his men swarmed any who hadn't fallen to the arrows, and he saw his friend cutting down the giant guard who barely had a chance to swing his hammer before he was wiped to the ground. Sir Daemon had moved just as quickly, and Arianne was hurried away, her guards surrounding them both, and it was then that he heard the red dragons roar. "Jaehaerys," he said, and as Quentyn raised his sword, Lord Yax let out her flames. Though not as fierce or as powerful as her brothers, they were enough to cover the prince and bring him to his knees, his screams loud as the flesh burned away from his face and his side. It was over quickly. They'd taken not even one loss. Prince Quentyn lived still, though he may wish he had not, and his death was only a matter of time. Aegon sent Tormund and his men to the women, relieved to see they were unhurt, and he left Quentyn laying in the sand. He turned to Dany to make sure she was not harmed, and once he was sure she wasn't, he called for his horse, and he, Sarieme, the Dothraki, and both Rhaegal and Lugarakes headed to the gates of the city. He didn't even need to ask for it. The surrender was given to him almost before he reached them. By the time he reached the old palace, it was theirs too. Most of Quentyn's men surrendered, none willing to face the dragons at their front or the spears at their back. And when Ned Dane made his way to him, Aegon told him about his aunt and nodded to Conno to see that he was given a horse so he could ride out and see her for himself. Daenerys, Arianne, and the others all arrived back with Ned when he returned with Aelia, Aegon meeting the woman only briefly as he spoke to Grey Worm and as Tormund spoke of the feast they had that night. He could see that Cacho and his men were disappointed. But they really shouldn't be. There would be many battles ahead where they could win glory, and those would be fought on lands that they knew far better than he. Aegon turned to Dyad, and they walked to the rooms they had been given. He knew there were those who wished to speak to him, and that recriminations would come, and yet he cared not. They'd taken the city back, they'd not harmed the small folk who lived there, and had lost few of their men. Nothing else truly mattered compared to that. "It worked," Dane said when they were alone. The dragon guard in their place at the door, and Laerox was flying outside their window. "It worked," he said, smiling. "Is it not wrong we broke parley?" she asked softly. "I broke parley, you did not," he said, and she shook her head. "We did so together, Aegon. What you do—" "I do," she said, and he nodded. Mrs. Dorne and I was only returning the favor. "Let them dare speak of us and try to judge dragons," he said, looking deep into her eyes. "For Daeron," she said softly, and he smiled as he kissed her. "For our family," he said, as, outside the window, Lord Yarrowlix let loose her flames. Tyros 305 AC. Samwell Tarly. His guards had ridden with him all the way to Old Town, and once there had insisted he took the first ship that headed to Essos. The bag of coin in his hand wasn't as large as he'd have wished for, and the thoughts of it running out and them needing to earn coin in Essos were daunting. What skills did he have that were useful to the Essos? What skills could he claim to have that wouldn't be proven false and leave him in an almost similar position in Essos as he faced in Westeros? No, he thought, as bad as Essos was, at least there a dragon and a man he'd thought he had the measure of wouldn't be seeking him dead. He thought himself so smart, had convinced himself that all Jon wanted was to have him out of his sight. Sam was even sure that in time he'd come to see the Dragon Queen for the monster she truly was, and when he did, he'd seek him out. If not Jon, then perhaps his sister or brother should he fall, though he wasn't sure that there was anything in this world that could bring Jon Snow down. Death itself couldn't end him. What chance did Cersei Lannister or Euron Greyjoy have of doing so? When he'd been forced from Winterfell, he'd found no one had stood for him. Not Bran, not Jorah, and since it was Jon himself forcing him away, not even the one person who always had. As they'd marched, he'd prayed that they'd both fall, or that the Dragon Queen would break Jon's spirit. He'd prayed and his prayers had gone unanswered. Jon Snow once again found a way to return as he always did, to be the hero that he always was, and Sam found he hated him even more for that. Had he been allowed to stay at Winterfell, then just as it had when he was at the Wall, Jon's glory would reflect a little onto him. Though he played no part, people would have believed him to be as vital as he led them to, as integral as he told them he was, instead of what he truly was and always had been. Once the news had come through and the victory was spoken of, he'd basically grabbed Gilly and little Sam, and they'd ridden hard to his home. He'd been welcomed as he knew he would be with his father dead, and though Tala wasn't as happy to see him as he'd expected, he'd not paid it too much mind. With his father and brother dead, he was the Lord now, and the comfortable life that had always been his true desire was his for the taking, or so he'd thought. It had not lasted long, and once again it was Jon Snow who forced him from it. "What is to become of us, Sam?" Gilly asked worriedly as he packed their things. "I don't know, we must travel to Essos, to go far from Jon and Daenerys as we can. He's not who I thought he was, and whether it's because of her influence, or perhaps the effects of his death finally starting to make him lose himself, I fear for us both," he said, shaking his head as he looked at her. "Do you really not believe his words about me and little Sam?" Gilly asked, holding the babe a little more tightly. "He told me I should come home. Gilly, that with my father and brother dead and my mother and sister alone, they'd need me. That, though I didn't wish it. I should be the Lord of Horn Hill for your sake and for little Sam's too. He told me that to my face, and then he sent that raven to my sister. I don't think we can trust anything that Jon Snow says," he said, and he was relieved when she moved to gather her things. As scared as he was at being forced from the north and then from Horn Hill, the thoughts of being alone were even more terrifying. He couldn't be alone, he'd never survive if he was, and he needed her company, both because of what they did at night and to simply help him survive. Sam couldn't do things for himself, not practical things. They had always been done for him. He'd always had help, and without Gilly to cook or clean or take care of him, he knew that he'd fall very quickly. So he was glad of her company as the ship set sail, even if at times she, Sam, and the babe she carried would be little more than a burden to him. The men on the ship laughed at him. He knew they took their amusement from him emptying his stomach constantly on the journey. Even the smallest of waves would make him lose his meal very quickly, and the larger ones would leave him in a constant state of the sickness of the sea. Gilly brought him water and food, even if it didn't stay in his belly for long. She questioned him far too often, though, and he was in a way glad he felt so terribly sick during the journey. Had he not been, then he knew she'd press for more answers, of which he had none. He'd hoped for Pentas, or even Bravos, only to find out it was to Tyrush the ship was headed, and no further. Sam then doing his best to remember all the books he'd read on the city and finding himself coming up blank when he tried to think of them. The closer they got to the city, the more Gilly questioned and became uncomfortable, both with his non-answers and with the warmth of the Essos weather. It had never occurred to him that she may find it uncomfortable, that, being from the true north, as she called it, having the sun beaming down on her may be an issue. If he was being honest with himself, then he'd find that he hadn't even given it any thought whatsoever. Instead, all he'd cared about was that the heat was better than the cold of the Wall and more comfortable for him, and they were moving further away from Jon Snow and his Dragon Queen. "We're here," the first mate shouted into their cabin, and Sam got up from his bed, feeling unsteady on his feet as he did so. "Sam?" Gilly said, moving to him and reaching out to stop him from falling. It was a close-run thing. Gilly was a mere slip of a thing. And Sam knew he'd put on more weight since he'd left the wall and wasn't forced to endure the meager meals they served him there. "Little Sam," he said softly, and he saw her smile as she turned from him and picked up the babe. It wasn't that he truly cared for the boy. He wasn't his blood after all, but each time he'd speak to him or play with him, or even ask about him, he knew it bought him more favor with his mother. "He's well. Are we leaving?" Gilly asked. "We are. We'll find a tavern to stay at, and then look around for somewhere more permanent," he said, and she nodded. It took them far longer than he had expected to find anything close to a tavern with rooms. There were many places that sold food and drink, some that even had rooms, though these were more for a man who sought company rather than one who wished to simply stay in them. Eventually, though, they found a place, and by the time he'd settled in, it was time for their evening meal. Sam found he enjoyed it immensely. The food was different to what they served in Westeros, and both Gilly and Little Sam barely picked at theirs, but he found the richness of it much to his taste. That it also had a chance to stay down gave him the incentive to almost gorge himself, and even though he spent more coin than he should, he felt he deserved to be spoiled a little. They were just about to take to their room when some men walked in and he looked at them worriedly. Sam could tell these men were warriors just by looking at them. He may not have ever been one, but he knew those who were true ones from those who were not just by sight. His father had been, J.R. Mormont had been, and Jon was one. These men carried themselves how each of them had, and when they came to his table, he felt his piss roll down his legs. He'd found him. He'd found him again. And perhaps this was when he'd see to his end. "Samwell Tarly," the man in front said, and he shook his head, almost slipping on the puddle of his own making as he tried to cower against the wall. "Leave him be. Leave Sam alone," Gilly said fiercely, and while he welcomed her defending him, he cursed her for naming him as the man they were looking for. "You're to come with us. The woman can stay or leave. We care not, but you've got a journey to make, Samwell Tarly," the man said, Sam finally getting a look at him more clearly now. He was tall and had a large scar down the side of his cheek along with the darkest, blackest eyes he'd ever seen. The men behind him were darker skinned and all had stripes of the color of jade on their cheeks, despite his desire to panic, to cower even more, and to run away as he begged for his life. Something struck him, a thought that he clung to. Slaves. These men were slaves, but not the same as the Dragon Queen's slaves. These were different. Who sent you?" he asked, his voice terrified and yet hopeful too. "Our Triarch, he wishes to speak to you about Daenerys Targaryen. You've work to do, Samwell Tarly, information to give, and should you prove yourself useful, then you'll be paid very well for your service," the man said. "What does your Triarch want with Daenerys Targaryen?" he asked, as he sat up a little more straight. Now that he believed these men weren't sent by Jon to kill him. "To see her fall," the man said, and Sam breathed out. His relief palpable, and yet there was excitement too. Perhaps he could come out of this alive and in a far better position after all. Dorne 305 AC. Dainty, he brought her to the edge again, and only when she pleaded and begged did he finally take her over it. Dany turning her head to see him behind her as they lay side by side on the bed. This position the one she found most comfortable for their lovemaking. That it gave Aegon the chance to bring his hands to bear far more easily was simply an added delight. She felt him kiss her lips, and then he was whispering in her ear. Dany quickly snuggling against him and feeling his hands go to her swollen belly as they always did once they were done. "You were right," she said with a chuckle. "I'm always right," he said back to her, and she slapped his shoulder just to see the look of mock hurt on his face. "I don't think I deserve that," he said, still pretending to be hurt. "You'll send a bad message to our babe. Poor Rhaella will think it is allowed for hands to be placed on a king. And I thought my husband liked it when I placed my hands on him," she said as she moved her hand between them and touched his now shrunken member. "My wife is incorrigible," Aegon said with a smirk. "You make me so," she said, kissing him once more. They lay in silence for a few moments, Aegon's hands rubbing her belly softly, the circles he was making with them relaxing her greatly, as they always did. "What was I right about?" he asked, breaking the silence. "That we didn't need to address the Dornish lords tonight," she said. "I've no wish to hear them complain and sit in judgment of our actions," he said, and she smiled. Glad he'd accepted that even though she'd gone along with him in what he had done, it was them, both of them, who had acted and not just he alone. "Nor have I. We took the city, Akan, and we lost barely 20 men to do so. Lord Diane, Lord Yarenwood, and Ser Demon showed their own gratitude when they realized what it was. Quentyn had intended to do. Meereen too, Aegon said. She did, though I fear her gratitude may be fleeting, she said, and felt his body tighten up and stiffen against her. You think she's playing us false? Aegon asked, and she swore if she turned to look at him, she'd see flames in his eyes. Such was how angered he sounded at the thought of such a thing. Her wolf was growing ever more dragon-like each and every day, and she found herself welcoming it greatly. It made her own feelings feel good and just, simply knowing that he felt them too, and that he was willing to do what she was. It gave her something she'd not known she'd needed, a sense of togetherness, belonging, a sense of knowing that she wasn't on the path her father had trodden, that Viserys had trodden. She was a dragon, Aegon was a dragon, and they would be dragons together, but their dragons only woke and were unleashed upon those who deserved it. I think politics is politics, Yakin, Dany said when she realized she'd not answered for some time. Dany, he asked, confused. Arianne has two masters to please, her Dornish ones and her dragon ones, she said as she rolled away from him and then turned to face him. Well, a master and a mistress, Aegon said, making her laugh. A master and mistress, she said, enjoying how his nostrils flared when she added the northern twang to her words. So, she has two masters and mistress, Aegon asked, bidding her continue. With us, she can be true. Tell us how she really feels about it, or not. Though I feel she'll speak her mind and has already. We gave her back her home. It cost her none of her men, and she lost none of the most important people held here. Sun's Spear and the old palace doesn't burn, and the army that invaded her lands is no longer here, and will not be coming back. Dany said as she rubbed her fingers down his cheek, and over the scar that began at his eye. No, they'll not. Yakin said determinedly, and she saw it then, the flash of fire that she enjoyed seeing so much, her lips moving to as of their own accord when she did so. So with us, she'll be grateful, truly. With the Dornish lords, she may have to play a different game, take their side, should they complain, she said and saw the flash once more. It's a fine line she must walk. We'll see if she walks it well. And if she does not, he asked her curiously. We are not our ancestors, Egan. We owe Dorne nothing, she said, and he smiled at her before he kissed her deeply. Sleep came very soon after, Yainty feeling herself being moved into Aegon's arms and knowing that she'd sleep as truly and as peacefully as she had done each night since they'd married. When she woke, it was to Aegon speaking to Lyrax, the red dragon laying out on the ground just outside their room as if she was an extra dragon guard. She dressed and walked outside to hear Aegon speaking to her, the red dragon's head turning to follow Aegon's words and chirping every so often. Dainty envied this a little, though she welcomed it too. His own connection to both Lyrax and to Rhaegon was different than hers, and never was this more apparent than when Aegon and the red dragon spoke. You did very well. I know you could have burned him completely. No, you're a very good dragon for showing restraint. Really? Well, I'm certain then that no one would ever dare harm your mother or me, and certainly not Rhys. Aegon said to loud chirps before he brushed his fingers over Lyrax's scales, and the dragon trilled and then took to the air. A needy dragon indeed, she said with a giggle. When Aegon turned to see her standing there, she wished to be praised. She deserved, did she not? Aegon said, She did, come. I'm starved, she said, holding out her hand, which he took. They made their way to a small room along with Ser Jaime and Ser Jorah. Brienne was resting up after being on duty the night before. Entering, she saw that Tormund was sitting there alone, his head in his hands and the sound he was making showing that he had a rough night, and she almost burst out in laughter at the mischievous look on Aegon's face as he moved towards him. Tormund, there you are. What say you? Up for a spar, perhaps a ride across the sands, or even in the air. Come, my friend. Aegon said, the loudness of his voice and the slap he hit to Tormund's back all showing his intent. Get away, or I'll gut you, little crow, Tormund said, shaking his head. What's this? Water? Have you turned over a new leaf, Tormund? Aegon said, picking up the mug from the table in front of Tormund, and Daniel looked to see that both Jorah and Ser Jaime were chuckling. These men are evil, Jon. I ask for a drink. They bring me this. Nothing I can say makes them give me what I need. Tormund said pleadingly, and she was happy to see Aegon take pity on him and send for wine. She laughed loudly when and their food arrived, to Dany eating ravenously while Aegon ate a little more sparingly. Tormund looked at them both and at the food and shook his head. instead drinking the wine straight from the jug and asking for more. "Tell them, little crow," Tormund said when the servants didn't move as quickly as he wanted. "Bring him more." Aegon said, and she finally saw a large smile on Tormund's face. By the time Melora, Grey Worm, Cano, and Brienne arrived, she'd eaten another full meal. The servant then arrived with a note from Princess Arianne, which she read and gave her a nod to let her know they'd be on their way. Tormund seemed in much better spirits, and when she told Aegon that the meeting had been set, she heard Tormund threaten any Dornishmen who dared to tell them they were in the wrong. "You took this city without using the dragons, without the use of your armies. I'll fucking gut anyone who says you were wrong to do so," Tormund said, and Aegon looked at her and smirked before he rolled his eyes, and she laughed so loudly that the whole room looked at her. "It seems Tormund is feeling better, my love," Aegon said, and just as she'd got her laughter under control, Tormund wiggled his eyebrows at her to show that he indeed was, and she was lost in laughter once more. King's Landing 305 AC. Paryai. Finding a face to use was the hardest thing. Arya for the first time not willing to take an innocent life to do so. Instead, she looked around and finally found where the Silent Sister saw to their wounded and injured. And after sneaking into where they kept their clothing, she dressed as one of them and moved among the beds. It didn't take her long to find the one that she needed. The man was a Stormland soldier who had run afoul at one of the brothels. His time was short, and yet it seemed to stretch on until he finally passed, and Arya was able to help them move him into the room so he could be prepared to be sent back home. Watching what they did to his body was repulsive even to her. Rosier looking on as the women cut the body up into small pieces and then dropped those pieces into the large pots to boil away the flesh. It would only be the bones that were sent back, and so the face wouldn't be missed. Yet it took her some time to get the chance to remove it and to drop the head into the pots with the other parts. Once she had done so, she quickly got rid of the clothes and made her way back to the Red Keep. It was to her misfortune that she ran into Missandei once she reached it. The girl, though, seemed happy, and when she shared her news with her, Arya was too. "They've taken Sunspear," Missandei said, while Arya felt the face as it was hidden among her clothes. "They are safe, both of them, the babe?" she asked eagerly. "They are. They'll not stay long and may even fly back together," Missandei said, and she could tell the girl was missing her queen just as much as Arya missed having her brother back with her. "I had thought it would take longer," she said almost to herself. "My queen and king do the things that no one else can," Missandei said proudly, and Arya smiled at her, having seen the truth of that more than once. "Where's Ghost?" she asked, noticing for the first time the White Wolf was nowhere in sight. "Hunting. He'll be back tonight," Missandei said. How she knew he'd be back tonight was something she could only put down to the girl's familiarity with the wolf. A sign that her brother was watching out for her, just as Sir Davos had said all those moons ago. It made her think of something else that Jon had said, something he'd spoken to her about more than once. How the wolves knew more than they did, and how he wished he'd listened to that more. It was something he had never fully explained to her, and she was more than certain it had to do with what had happened at the wall. She wondered if he'd not paid attention to Ghost for some reason, and it made her wonder had they all done so at some point. "I must go to my meeting. We'll eat together later?" Missandei asked, and Arya smiled at her and nodded. She hurriedly made her way to her room and hid the face with the others she'd used before. Were it not Edric Storm she was seeking out, then any of these would have been enough for her. But she needed one that could get past his guards or not raise questions from them. And so, a Stormlands man was for the best. The rest of the day she spent training. Gendry was working with his old master Tobo Mott and making her a present, and everyone else, it seemed, was busy with their own works. It made her feel a little useless, if she was being honest, and other than her wish to play the game of faces with Edric to confirm or assuage her worries, she'd found little to keep her occupied in King's Landing. With Jon away fighting, Dany with him, and Gendry busy, she'd hoped to have found some other meaning in her life, something else to keep her focused on. She'd even started to read up on what the requirements of running a keep was, not that she had any intent to do so, but she had been so very bored, and so had given it a go. It was not for her, and yet she seemed to understand the basics of it well enough, according to Sir Davos. The Onion Knight telling her that no matter how large the keep or the lands that fell under it, at the end of the day, it was all the same basic principle. You keep it stocked, make it secure, and that the people under your protection have both it and your help to see them fed and sheltered. "Surely there's more to it than that," she said, shaking her head. Your brother told me that in the end, your only job is to keep the people safe and fed. The rest is just noise and propriety. Davos said with a chuckle. He doesn't do propriety, she said, making the older man laugh some more. Thank fuck for that. Davos said, and she nodded her agreement. She was making her way back to her room and was still smirking as she thought about it, her smile soon falling from her face when she both remembered that her brother wasn't here, and when she then saw Edric Storm a little ahead of her. She moved quickly in the other direction and so reached her rooms a little later than she wished. After a quick bath where she spent far more time touching the small swell of her stomach than actually washing, she dressed, and as she was doing so, Gendry arrived back from his day at the Smiths. Are you done yet? She asked him, after they'd kissed for a few moments. Almost. One more day, and then you can see it, he said, and she nodded. She was annoyed he'd not tell her what it was, but for now was far more eager to get to the night's work that she had planned. We're to eat with Davos and Miss Andai, she said, and he smiled. Davos as much a father to Gendry as he was to Jon at times. It was at the hour of the wolf that she finally got her chance. Arya taking the face, while Gendry slept, and then making her way through the keep. When she reached where Edric was staying, the guard looked at her oddly. Arya not sure why that was, until she realized that the face she wore was at death's door, until recently, after convincing the man she was well, and then telling him she'd do his night's duty for him. She was soon left alone, though she waited some time until she was sure she'd not be disturbed. Still, it was only a few moments later that she was holding her knife to Edric Storm's neck. Have you heard of the House of Black and White? She asked, and she saw him nod, his eyes wide and the sweat falling from his brow. You and I are about to play a game. I'm going to ask you some questions. If you lie, then the many-faced god will be getting a gift this night. Do you understand what I'm saying? She asked, her voice not hers, but of a long-dead guardsman. I understand, he said, his panic and worry clear in his voice. Less than an hour later, she was climbing into her bed even more quietly than she had left it. She had been right about him, about her fears, and she was ready to give him the gift. But a voice called out to her and told her to find another way. Whose voice that was, she wasn't sure. She thought it was Jon's. At first, but then she remembered that her brother had never told her what to do. True, he may have suggested it and spoken to her about it, but he never told her or even asked her. Then she'd thought the voice was Gendry's and that it was him not wishing her to end his kin. Yet it was different, younger, though it sounded a little like both of them. A part of her believed it was the babe that grew inside of her. A son who'd be like his father, like her brother, and so she'd withheld the gift for now, and instead left him with a warning, instead. The many-faced god is watching you, Edric Storm. Should any harm befall your half-brother, then the next time we meet shall be your last. You cannot hide from us, cannot protect yourself from us, and even in your keep, you'll not be safe from us. Should we be forced to come, then it won't just be the Frys they'll talk about falling in the night. Was she right to do so? Right to let him live? She knew not, only that when she left the room the voice had told her that she was Sunspear 305 AC. Melora? Axling had asked her to look into where the army was, and so she had. He'd asked her to send word to the Red Keep about their victory, and so she had. Then he'd asked her to keep Quentin alive so that he could speak to him, and so she did. Though he would not live for long, and he'd spoken to his sister even before he had to the king. His injuries were severe, and without her help, he'd suffer even more than he was, and his time was coming to an end. If Aegon wished it, if Dany wished it, then Quentin could live for a few more days in agonizing pain. She had made this clear to him, to Princess Arianne, and she and her guards had made it clear that no one was to offer him the easy way out. The Maester, the servants, any who came close to the burned frog prince, were checked and double-checked. Melora herself staring each and every one of them in the eye and making it clear that she knew things they thought no one but they themselves did. As a deterrent or a way to see her king and queen's will was done, it was as good a one as any. Your Grace, she said as the door opened and Aegon stepped inside. How is he? The ex again asked with no concern for the man, other than to know how hard he could be pushed. He is ready, Your Grace, she said, and she watched as Sir Jaime moved everyone but her and the king from the room, and as Aengain then moved closer to the prince. These men you work with, speak to me of them, and I'll see your suffering is allowed to end. Speak and speak the truth, Martell. For if you do not, then I'll give the order that you're to live for many days to come. Aegon said, and she heard the prince gasp. Beliko Stagonso. He's a Triarch in Volantis, the leader of the Tigers, a dangerous man and one with ambition. Quentin said, his voice pained but able to be heard. How powerful is he? He asked. Very. Even the other Triarchs fear him, Quentyn said. And my wife, what reason does he have to wish my wife dead? Aegon asked, his voice remarkably calm as he did so, yet she could see the effort he was making to remain so. He wants Usse, she stands in the way, and there is some more to it, but of that I know not, Quentyn said, Aegon looking to her and seeing her nod that he spoke the truth. This army, the one that's gone from Dorne, who leads it? Aegon asked. Malachy Migair, another tiger, Quentyn said gasping as Aegon reached for some water and gave it to him. She looked on as Aegon held the mug in his hands. She'd told him the army had headed north and she'd sent her birds to fly and seek them out. Melora knew that he would ask her to seek answers too, to look and see what she could find, and if there were any faults in his plan. He'd done so when he and the Queen had spoken about what they had wished to do with Sunspear. Melora looking deep within herself and offering up small changes only. After he was done here, she'd no doubt it would be to the north. He'd go, and she knew that he'd seek her to find those very same answers before he left. Why does he wish to go north? Aegon asked, and Quentyn looked surprised. This was obviously news to him. He went north. He took his army and sailed to the north. Why? He asked. His daughter Talisa, he blames your family for her death, Quentyn said. My family? What have the Targaryens got to do with Talisa's death? That was the phrase Tywin Lannister and Roose Bolton, and all of them are dead. Aegon said, the Starks. He blames the Starks. He blames Robb Stark for leading her astray, for marrying her and taking her to the twins. He wants you all dead, wants the North to suffer, Westeros to suffer, Quentyn said before coughing loudly.